may be seated. So, before we begin taking a look at Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, seemingly a topic that doesn't really have any pertinence to us today, for most of us, I think it's just helpful perhaps to kind of lay some groundwork. The city of Corinth in Greece was no doubt a very intentional place of ministry on the part of Paul. Even though the majority of those who resided in the city were Greek, it really had become a bustling Roman community because it was a pivotal port and largely important for trade going east and west. In that city, up on the highest place in the region, stood the temple of Aphrodite, who was considered to be by the Greeks the goddess of love and beauty, which sounds nice, except for the fact that this temple was also the locale for a very busy business of prostitution. And that, in part, is why this city increasingly became known as a city of absolute immorality. Now, also in that city, right at its center, stood the market, the gathering place, whether it be for business or art or social events or political rallies. It also constituted kind of the spiritual center of the city. And it's very likely that in this marketplace, Paul preached his earliest sermons to the people that lived there. He had success. There were believers in this city of Corinth. And it's clear that Paul had received a letter from these young believers living there, because that's really made evident in the letter, the first letter that we have, the first letter to the Corinthian church, from Paul's hand. He was pointedly addressing some of the questions that they had sent to him in a previous letter, a letter which we don't have in hand these days. But Paul was specifically addressing some of his concerns even above and beyond the questions that they had sent to him. One of his primary concerns was the fact that in this new church, in this young group of believers, there already were divisions or factions that were starting to form. He also was very aware that there was a significant lack of understanding of the truth of the gospel, even though he himself had brought the teaching to them. And importantly, and not surprisingly perhaps, in this particular setting, there was a significant reality, even among believers, followers of Christ, where there was significant sexual immorality still happening. But in addition to Paul's kind of base awareness of these concerns, he wanted to also respond to their specific questions. And in chapter 7, preceding the portion that we read today, Paul answered one of those specific questions, and it was around the issue of marriage and divorce. And then the second question, which we read, or Karen read for us this morning, was around the question of whether it was okay for Christians to eat meat that had previously been involved in sacrificing to idols in the city. Now, historians, biblical scholars have for many, many years appreciated the fact that within Paul's letter, there is rich information, historical information about the concrete situations that the early church in this particular area, Corinth, the issues they faced as believers in the context of surrounding pagan culture. Now, to my thinking, despite the fact that the specific question that chapter 8 answers in Paul's letter, the question about eating meat offered to idols, isn't one that faces any of us today. So, does that render it as irrelevant or insignificant? I think not, because like the historians who can appreciate the concrete examples of life in that day, in that locale, we can celebrate the fact that though Paul was responding to with thorough and thoughtful detail, responding to questions that don't necessarily apply to us today, still embedded in his response are insights and principles that we can apply to a broader array of questions for us living in this environment in this day. In a sense, this portion of Paul's letter allows us to see a bit about how we can live out our faith in the context in which we live. How many of you have heard the phrase, we're to be in the world but not of it? Okay, a lot of nods, a lot of hands. Chapter and verse, can anybody tell me where that's from? That is a trick question, because it's not Scripture. However, to be in the world, yet not of the world, is absolutely consistent with the teaching of Scripture. John chapter 15 quotes Jesus as having said, "The world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it. But you are no longer part of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, so it hates you." You see the parallel there? In the world, but not of it. And then Paul, in his letter to the Romans, wrote, "Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect." In the world, but not of it. Jesus and Paul both understood the tension that believers did and would experience by following Christ while living in what at times feels a hostile environment, an unbelieving culture. The challenge for all Christians, regardless of when and where we and they have sought to live out the faith, is how to continue in our relationships with the world, the people that comprise the world around us, and yet also be careful to live lives that are first pleasing to God, even if they're not popular in the wider culture. Now, unlike this very serious question that came from the Corinthian believers, in our day, eating meat that had been offered to idols doesn't really constitute a difficulty for us. Well, at least not where we shop. I mean, Jericho Market, Hannaford's, P&C, even Healthy Living, right? But in my reading this past week, I encountered kind of a broad swath of treatments, if you will, of this passage. Some humorous, some very sensitive and thoughtful. I'm going to read a brief quote. For many people in the U.S., the primary questions raised about meat are, do I want chicken, beef, or pork tonight? Is this grass-fed or grain-fed? And then, do I want regular bacon, low-sodium bacon, or, God forbid, turkey bacon? Then there's the more contemporary continuum along the lines of vegan, vegetarian, this was a new one to me, lacto-ovo vegetarian, to those omnivores who can and do eat and enjoy anything, from Spam to haggis. Now, we have, in our married life and family life over the years, had seasons of vegetarian direction of diet. There have been other times where beef. In the early days of our marriage, we ate a lot of Spam because that was not as expensive as a lot of other meats. But never did we have to face such a question of how do we deal with food that had been involved in offering to idols. Yet, like those Christians in Corinth, we also can take from Paul's response insights and principles that do apply to our contemporary setting. Ultimately, though voiced with the initial verse of this passage, ultimately Paul comes to what I've described as a foundational insight or principle. And that is simply that love is paramount over knowledge. Paul offers this foundational principle in the very first verse. Now, regarding your question about food that's been offered to idols, yes, we know that we all have knowledge, quote unquote, about this issue. But while knowledge makes us feel important, it's love that strengthens the church. Now, I'm exaggerating the so-called air quotes, but it's important that that be recognized as a quote by Paul. Paul's writing often involves complex and long-winded compositions. He addresses an issue, and does so here in the letter to the Corinthian church, several points. He addresses an issue in a way that's sort of like he holds up the question and turns it around to see it from a lot of different perspectives or angles. But that said, Paul's focus is always evident. It's always obvious. He is most concerned that Christians explore and understand the question of how our actions as followers of Christ impact the lives of others. And then secondarily, or consequentially, how that understanding on our part, how that knowledge on our part should impact our own behavior going forward. So once we're aware of the impact of our behavior, what do we do with that awareness? That is Paul's focus. He wasn't writing about general knowledge in his response, but about, in this case, very specific knowledge, about religious knowledge, spiritually related questions of knowledge. Because in the context of his receiving the letter to which this chapter is a part of his response, he was responding to a context within this young body of believers where the statement or assertion of one's knowledge was bringing about an attitude of arrogance on the part of some. So what Paul was really addressing here is the dangerous internal opposition or divisions that were troubling the church in Corinth. And that's what had prompted their letter to him. And Paul sort of places two views, opposing views, in his response. The first view, I guess we could call self-importance based on knowledge, on the one hand, and on the other, a self-sacrificing love for others. So verse 1, he basically states simply, while knowledge makes us feel important, it's love that strengthens the church. But then he goes on to expand on that simple answer. Verse 2, anyone who claims to know all the answers doesn't really know much. But the person who loves God is the one whom God recognizes. So what about eating meat that's been offered to idols? Well, we all know that an idol is not really a god, but that there's only one God. Now, there are so-called gods both in heaven and on earth, and some people actually worship many gods and many lords. It's kind of like in verse 1, it seems Paul was agreeing with the faction that claimed to be right, that claimed to be in the know, when he wrote, we all have knowledge. But Paul was actually, in that particular string, quoting a phrase that had come from the Corinthian church to him. And it was a phrase, we all have knowledge, coming from those who arrogantly asserted they had knowledge, and their knowledge justified their behavior. He then turns the slogan back on to those people who had this arrogant sense of importance about themselves. And what he does is he points out to them how they had been essentially misusing their knowledge. And in so doing, it was a diminishing of the unity in this fledgling young church in the city of Corinth. And Paul did this throughout this, what we call the first letter to the Corinthians. In chapter 6, he writes, all things are lawful for me, but not everything is beneficial. Now, all things are lawful for me is another phrase that he was quoting from the believers' letter coming from Corinth. And in chapter 6, the context was specifically around the difficulty that sexual immorality that persisted even amongst believers, the new believers in Corinth. He uses literally the same phrase again in chapter 10. All things are lawful for me, but not everything is beneficial. In chapter 10, he's pointing back to how Israel had provoked God over and over and over. He's using their phrases to challenge their behaviors. Have you ever met someone or talked with someone who very quickly makes clear to you that they know everything that there is to know about everything? Anybody had that experience? I hear chuckles. Lord, help us if that be us. But the reality is sometimes that type of behavior, that type of arrogance can come simply from a place of insecurity on the part of one who presents themselves as knowing all. Simply insecure in themselves, they have to posture as though they were confident and secure. But in this instance, it appears from Paul's reply to the church in Corinth that it was coming rather than a place of insecurity, it was coming from a place of arrogance, a place of pride. Verse 2, don't forget, Paul said, anyone who claims to know all the answers doesn't really know much. I've been challenged over the years, most often by my bride, Christine, to talk more, that I'm not really a terribly quick communicator in dialogue. And I always kind of had this image of the silent, strong type, right? That's kind of what I wanted to see myself to be. Anybody familiar with the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales? One of the great Clint Eastwood films of all time. He was the strong, silent type. But that was an excuse on my part to not express what's on my mind. And then I encountered Proverbs chapter 17, verse 28. Even fools are thought wise when they keep silent. With their mouths shut, they seem intelligent. So there's biblical mandate to be quiet. Well, when the issue underlying being a know-it-all is that of arrogance or pride, that's one thing. But in contrast to such pride, Paul brings up as its opposite the reality that it's love that strengthens the church. And in verse 3, he expands on this notion of love. In this particular case, the Greek term agape. He expands on the notion of love, designating the person who loves God as the one who God recognizes. Other translations would suggest that it's more than just God recognizing the one who loves him, but it's more a matter of God actually knowing firsthand that one who expresses love to him. Paul really is pointing out the enormous chasm between intellectual knowledge on the one hand and experiential knowledge on the other. The facts, if you will, and the relationship. Big difference between them. Yet both could be identified as knowledge. And at the same time, he is shifting focus from the desire to be right on the part of the one who has pride in their knowledge, shifting that desire to a desire to build and nurture the church through love. Essentially, Paul is calling the Corinthians, and he's calling us in this passage, into humility rather than hubris. And he's encouraging both them and us in this passage to be affectionate rather than arrogant. So, regardless of whatever knowledge we may claim to have or think that we have, that knowledge is still incomplete and imperfect, particularly in the context of our knowing God. But Paul reminds us that our knowing, when coupled with love for God, it results in us being known by God. Our love for God does not result in our knowing God fully, but it motivates us to know him more deeply, to understand and emulate his character, his nature more consistently. As our love for him grows, our capacity to love others increases as well. Now, after Paul wrote that an idol is not really a god and that there's only one God, in verse 6 he adds this: there is one God, the Father, by whom all things were created and for whom we live. And there's one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things were created and through whom we live. Yet the knowledge that an idol is not really a god, if that knowledge remains separate from love, it remains imperfect, incomplete, and, as Paul continues, it can even be harmful. Now, none of us can gain God's approval by the things we do or don't do. But God knows us. He knows our hearts. And the risk for harm comes when any one of us claims to have knowledge that is complete and sufficient, perfect. That's a false claim. Because so often those types of claims of knowledge intends to simply justify behaviors that follow because of a sense of freedom. Paul says very clearly, be careful so that your freedom does not cause others with a weaker conscience to stumble. Paul minces no words here. Because of your superior knowledge, a weak believer for whom Christ died will be destroyed. And when you sin against other believers by encouraging them to do something they believe is wrong, you are sinning against Christ. Paul, in this portion of his letter, was responding clearly to a particular question, a particular problem that was causing a lot of tension, a lot of trouble between the believers in this newly formed church in Corinth. And Corinth, as I mentioned earlier, was still heavily influenced by both Greek culture and Greek religious practices. Practices that for many who'd come to faith in Jesus really meant nothing any longer. They had left those practices. But for others who were still struggling with their history, their religious engagement and practices, it troubled them. This is what Paul was concerned about. Those who understood and had knowledge that these idols were not of any power, they certainly were not God, they experienced a sense of freedom. But in their freedom, the risk was that others who did not have that freedom still may have taken steps that would have violated their conscience. Certainly, Paul should have been free because of his knowledge, his encounter with Christ on many years before, and the journey that he was then on, living a life of an apostle, bringing the truth of the gospel across regions far wider than he probably ever anticipated traveling. Yet in his freedom, he admonished those who claimed a similar freedom with these words: "If what I eat causes another believer to sin, I will never eat meat again as long as I live. For I don't want to cause another believer to stumble." Boy, I like cheeseburgers. The question of eating meat was important, was critical for the growth and the unity of the church in Corinth. But like I said earlier, the question that Paul was answering for them in his letter really is not something we face today. But his thorough, his thoughtful answer provides us still today with insights and principles that we can carry into pretty much any societally charged question in our context. You know, churches the world over back in the spring of 2020 were faced with the question of whether or not to continue to gather, to meet. The other spelling of meet, M-E-E-T, not M-E-A-T. COVID exploded on the world scene. And the question of whether or not to continue to meet, as churches have done, unimpeded in this nation for centuries, then gave way to questions of whether or not the requirement of wearing masks really should apply. And these questions and these challenges in many, many churches across not only this country but across the world gave rise to vehemently held perspectives. In fact, brought about pretty fractious challenges between believers in the context of church. Now, certainly not as politically charged. The question that when Chris and I first came to this congregation a year ago, the question that still remained within this congregation involves some pretty strongly held opinions about the Habitat Project. That particular question, along with others that have, that are, and will be faced by this congregation, still benefit from Paul's insights and that one main or foundational principle. During my time here with you, our time here with you, over the past year, you have all demonstrated over and over again the one main principle found in today's epistle reading from the hand of the Apostle Paul. It is love that strengthens the church.